Good morning, America. In today's video, I'd like to speak about some recent developments with Paul Manafort. He was sentenced today in federal court to 47 months in prison. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, he was President Trump's former campaign chairman. He was also a lobbyist. He was actually convicted last summer for financial crimes. He was sentenced to almost 47 months, which amounts to basically almost 4 years in prison for conviction on financial fraud convictions. I believe there was 8 counts of fraud, and he was convicted. Now, the convictions were obtained by Special Counsel Robert Mueller in his investigations of any collusion with Russia, but these financial frauds actually had nothing to do. They were separate from the Trump campaign and actually had to do with lobbying work that Paul Manafort did for other political parties, which we'll talk about. Now, the fraud convictions, although they weren't related necessarily to President Trump's presidential campaign in 2016, the fraud convictions basically came directly out of Robert Mueller's investigation of the election, and basically his investigation of whether or not there was any possible collusion with Russia during the election. Specifically, Manafort was looking at, were people in President Trump's political campaign, were they in contact with Russia, with Russian authorities, with Russian agents? Were they, doing deals with the Russians? As you'll recall, there was a business issue relating to Mr. Trump with regards to putting a Trump Tower in Moscow at around this same time. So that's the main thing that Paul, Robert Mueller was looking for with Paul Manafort. Was there some type of financial arrangement or some type of collusion that was taking place? And the fraud convictions stemmed out of the investigation, but had nothing to do with the actual election. They occurred because what they found was that Paul Manafort lied about many things, regarding his background, and his other lobbying, activities, because he, while he was the campaign chairman for the Trump, presidential, election, he actually has been a lobbyist for many, many years, and he's worked with many other parties, and most of the crimes that Manafort was convicted for had to do actually with his political lobbying and consulting for the country of Ukraine. So that's where his convictions came from. But they were basically found by Robert Mueller and his team when they were investigating this, and they said, well, we've just uncovered these other crimes which we're obligated to, bring to light and bring to prosecution. Now, the sentencing that took place of 47 months, or almost 4 years in prison, was actually considered very light by most legal experts. The prosecutors had been asking for up to 25 years in prison for, these financial crimes. Now, Paul Manafort is 69 years old, so that would have basically amounted to a life sentence. The judge in this case, Judge Ellis, considering everything, considering the crimes, and, determining the sentence, he felt that the sentencing recommendation of 19 to 25 years in prison, which is what the prosecutors had officially asked for, was excessive. And he felt that the lesser sentence of 47 months was just and was appropriate for the crimes that had been committed. People in the Trump administration and supporters of Paul Manafort have, basically stated all along that Paul Manafort really didn't get fair treatment or treatment like anyone else who was convicted of, financial fraud crimes, in that he was sort of targeted and singled out basically because he was part of the Trump administration, and that's why he was unfairly sort of targeted and harassed. People feel that basically the strategy by Mueller was to uncover these separate fraud issues and income tax evasion issues, and basically to have something on Manafort and then say, okay, well, we have this on you, we're going to hold this over you unless you cooperate with us and give us information on collusion with Russia, crimes during the election, anything related to illegal activities with regards to Russia, which is actually the whole point behind, or the main focus, I should say, behind, Mueller's investigation. So Manafort and his supporters have said that all along, that, we're being unfairly targeted and basically pressured, and that these charges are being brought to us with these, huge sentences of 25 years in prison just because they're trying to squeeze us to become basically, to testify and to give information. And you saw the same thing with Robert Cohen, or Michael Cohen, excuse me, President Trump's former lawyer, where he had all these criminal investigations on him, all these charges in federal court. The Manhattan U.S. District Attorney was bringing charges, and, finally, under that pressure, he kind of, at first, he tried to, say, no, I'm not going to talk, I'm not going to, give up any information, but they just, kept coming more and more and more pressure, until basically he had to say, well, I really have no choice but to cooperate with authorities, otherwise I'm going to be in prison for the rest of my life. So that's sort of the same approach that, the Paul Manafort felt was being pushed onto him, that, he's being squeezed with this threat of 25 years in prison just to give up information on, activities with Russia during the campaign, and cooperation and collusion with Russia during the presidential campaign by the Trump, camp. Now, the actual crimes, as I mentioned previously, they had nothing to do with the actual election. These crimes actually took place before the election. He was convicted of defrauding banks and also defrauding the federal government. And actually failing to pay taxes on $1 million of income, millions of dollars in income that he earned from Ukraine, performing political consulting and also lobbying for them in Washington. Now, Manafort's actually not done with his sentencing. The prosecution decided to break up all the charges into two separate trials. So Manafort still has to be sentenced next week for additional crimes that he was also convicted of in a separate trial. And those include witness tampering, conspiracy related to the years of illegal Ukrainian lobbying and money laundering. And interestingly, the sentences could be either concurrent or consecutive, and that's entirely at the judge's discretion. So, if the sentences are concurrent, then, as long as the additional sentence doesn't go over 47 months, then Manafort would serve the one prison sentence. If the judge were to feel that, these additional crimes should be, additional time should be served, then he could run those sentences consecutively. So Manafort would have to serve out the 47 months for the crimes that he was sentenced for, and then he would have to serve out any additional sentence starting in 47 months for these additional crimes. And that's, again, 100% at the judge's discretion. The judge will just take into consideration what are the crimes, what is the gravity of the crimes, and should these sentences run together, can he serve out both sentences at the same time, or will they be consecutive? And again, that's just entirely up to the judge. As with what we saw this week with the sentencing for 47 months, the judge could have sentenced Manafort to 25 years. So 47 months was very light in comparison to what he could have faced. And just to be clear, these are federal crimes, basically anything with money laundering, with income tax evasion. Those are all basically crimes against the United States government. So this is federal prison, and unlike with state prisons, there is no parole system or early release. So if you're sentenced to 47 months, barring some outside force, you'll serve out the entire 47 months. Now, Manafort actually has already served 9 months in prison. He's been in prison for the last 9 months, so he will receive credit for the time that was served. And the defense attorneys have requested that Manafort serve out the remainder of his sentence at a prison camp for federal inmates in Cumberland, Maryland. But again, this is entirely up to the judge's discretion, and the judge can decide where Manafort will serve out his sentence. In addition to, the prison time, Manafort must also pay a fine of $50,000, and he must also make restitution to the government. Like I said, he was convicted of income tax evasion. They're saying he never paid taxes on all the monies that he earned from all this lobbying work for the country of Ukraine. He never paid any taxes on any of this money. So he needs to pay restitution of at least $6 million of taxes that were never paid, but the figure could go as high as $25 million, depending upon the government's forfeiture proceeding, because they're going to seize a lot of his assets in order to recoup all this money, and it could go as high as actually $25 million. It will just depend upon how the forfeiture proceeding goes and what what they're able to seize basically of his personal property. Now, interestingly, and a lot of people point this out, Manafort did make a statement at sentencing, but he never apologized or expressed regret for his crimes, and as I stated previously, the judge made it very clear that Manafort was being sentenced for the crimes that he was convicted of, and nothing having to do with the 2016 election or collusion with Russia. And I think, again, the judge wanted to make that statement because, as I mentioned again previously, the defense team and also Paul Manafort have said all along that, we're being targeted here. This has nothing to do with, these fraud convictions or this income tax stuff. This has to do with the special counsel, Robert Mueller, putting the squeeze on us, treating us unfairly so that we'll, make statements or testify against the Trump administration or the Trump campaign or other people in the Trump campaign, that they had illegal activities or illegal dealings with Russia. And Manafort never ever apologized or expressed regret for the crimes that he was convicted of, and he maintained all along that he never colluded with anyone during his time in as the campaign chairman with Russian or any foreign agents or foreign governments or any governments. Ukraine, he had connections with Ukraine. He said he never had any connections on the part of Donald Trump or dealings with Ukraine during his time as the campaign chairman. During that time, he was solely focused on the Trump campaign domestically here in the United States. So, and the judge did make it clear that Manafort, was just being sentenced for the crimes that basically were brought before the court and that he was convicted of, and basically nothing to do with the 2016 election or Russia or anything along those lines. Now, several legal experts who've been following this case have said all along that Manafort and his defense team, a lot of what they're doing is strategic. People said, well, why didn't Manafort apologize? Why didn't Manafort express regret? And it's because he's sort of sticking to this hard line, idea that, I'm being treated unfairly here. I'm being targeted unfairly here by this investigation. Now, President Trump has called this investigation unjust. He's called it a witch hunt. So a lot of people believe that Manafort and his defense team have a strategy in place where, they're going to say, hey, I was targeted, unfairly. The Mueller investigation, which is wrapping up and the report's going to be released any day now, didn't find that I did any of these crimes, so I was targeted unjustly and prosecuted unjustly, and basically made a scapegoat, for this dealings with Russia, which never took place and never happened. So, it's believed that Manafort and his defense team are basically seeking a presidential pardon from Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump does have the power to grant pardons, but it's very uncertain at this time whether President Trump will actually use that power to grant Manafort a pardon. It just remains to be seen. And we saw something similar recently with, Michael Cohen, where he was testifying and he said, I did not ask for a presidential pardon, nor would I accept a presidential pardon. And actually President Trump came out and said that that's not true. So, there's more, to that story, which will probably be coming out. But, in this particular case for Paul Manafort, several people believe that, Manafort is going to strongly push either privately or publicly through his defense team for a presidential pardon from Donald Trump. Now, part of that will probably have to do with this additional sentencing that's going to be taking place next week for these additional crimes. Again, if that sentence runs consecutively, and amounts to, considerable prison time, there may be more pressure on Trump to actually go ahead and grant this pardon. But, only time will tell, what happens, because, this story's obviously not over. It's still evolving as everything comes out with the Mueller investigation, the Mueller report, which is going to be released, like I said, any day now. So, again, we'll just have to wait and see. But, Manafort is, already in prison. He's been in prison for 9 months, and he'll have 47 months total, and then anything in addition that he gets next week at his additional sentencing. So again, it's a wait and see for that camp in terms of what's happening. So that's it for this video. I'd love to hear what you guys think on all of this. Please be sure to like the video, subscribe and turn on notifications, and comment below. Let me know what you think. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Have a great day.